Welcome to We the World and our 2025 Manifesting the Dream event. Each year, we take time to remember Martin Luther King Jr. and his beloved community. And each year, we are thrilled to feature the many people and organizations who have taken action to be of service, not only in January and February, but all year round. We at We the World have been showcasing actions and services from January 15th to February 28th. We hope you have enjoyed these snapshots and that perhaps you have been inspired to bring your creative and heartfelt service actions to life. Remember, change can happen with just one person, and you can be that person. And we would be happy to help. Go to https://we.net and take the plunge. Of course, donations are always very appreciated and accepted at we.net/donate. So let's begin. My name is Jana Larson, and I am the HR Deputy Director of We the World. And now I present our guests. Some people are supposed to be together. Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald are two of those people. And some people are lucky enough to hold the matching right place, right time cards. And again, that would be Liz and Paul. What they have seen and done and written about is the stuff of great novels and films. Articulation of these experiences is only a very small part of their "we were there" reports, suitable for print and film, for the podium, for campfires, and beyond. In the years since 9/11, much has happened to bring Liz and Paul's life stories into sharp focus. Their efforts at combining personal diplomacy with activist journalism is a model for restoring a healthy and vibrant dialogue to American democracy. As authors, their book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, lays bare why it was inevitable that the Soviet Union and the US should end up in Afghanistan, and what that means to the future of the American empire. Leave it to say, their projects are inspired by cosmic events, eliciting reactions of awe. In truth, one almost has to suspend disbelief because the revelations they have discovered will make one go, hmm. But for today's special presentation, we are keeping that which I have mentioned about Liz and Paul. Here is the backdrop. Today we are focusing on Martin Luther King Jr. With their help, we are setting the stage for going back to another time. Enter Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald to take us there. I present Liz and Paul. Thank you for taking time out to be here as part of our MLK Manifesting the Dream spectacular event.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with just a little thing about MLK, and then I'm going to be asking you questions that go along with that time period. And I'm very fascinated to hear what you saw, what you observed, not what we've read about, but what you saw and observed. In his young adult life, as a doctor of philosophy and theology, MLK was strongly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi and his concept of love and nonviolence as a way to work towards social reform. He was a major visible proponent for the civil rights movement in the mid 1960s. This was when several historic events were happening that he was a part of creating: the Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-in movement, the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery marches. Certainly, these were newsworthy happenings, obviously taking place in the nation's capital in the South. Listen, Paul, I'm going to ask a few questions all together and you can answer it how you want. Where were you in the mid 60s? How old were you? When, where, and how did you meet? And what had life been like for each of you in your respective families of origin in this time period of the mid 60s?
I'm going to start with this saga, I guess. 1968 was a very pivotal year for me personally. I came from a very conservative Irish Catholic family in Boston. We're not super conservative, but the fact is that, we were very concerned about the things that were happening. Martin Luther King was, of course, very much a part of the Kennedy administration, 1963, which ended in 1963, and very much so even more after that. So in 1968, I was a junior in high school. And being a junior in high school at 17 years old, I was very well aware of the fact that the draft was hanging over everyone's head. My age, we were all obligated. We'd had previous years from my high school go off to Vietnam and come back in less than the best condition. The drug addiction was huge, was already happening. And before they even got to Vietnam. So Vietnam just kind of like, it brought that into the experience. So the world was changing. I was the youngest in my family. My older brothers and sisters had gone through high school, graduated in the 1950s. And for me, it was a completely different world. So the Tet Offensive, January 1968, started with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. And that kind of unveiled. William Westmoreland had been telling the American public and telling the president that everything was going to be fine, that the US was winning the war and all the escalations that had happened in terms of the troop commitment were paying off, that we were pacifying Vietnam and instituting a democratic government. And the fact is that when that happened, it was such a shock to the system. Everybody wandered around. I remember going to school that morning on January 29th, on January 30th, and saying to myself, my father had been in World War II. I said, we're not going to win this war. This clearly is something else. There's something else happening here. So it made me instantly aware, and all my friends aware, of the fact that what we were being told by the authorities was not the real story. So that
all right. And that is very true. That's what a lot of people were feeling. But how does Liz come into the story? How did you meet? Where how old were you both?
Well, Paul and I met, okay, in 1970. What Paul's talking about in 1960,
Oh, okay. So
right, was actually the steps that he took to get to the right place where we met, okay? So let me fill in a few of those missing pieces, and then I can introduce my own involvement of that.
well, but I want to concentrate on U.S. people, not as, political statements or what, was happening there, but how your views as young people. That's what I want to concentrate on. You are aware that all this is happening and it's been affecting your life, your family's life, the people in the community, your friends' life. But so when you were meeting in this time of MLK and Vietnam War, how old were you? Just like set the setting, like we're in a play about where you're at as young people.
I was actually a college student in Boston, and I was very, very involved in 1966, 67, 68 in the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. And it turned out, though, what ended up happening was in 1970, there was a production of Hair coming to Boston, and
That's my next thing that I want to talk about.
a lot of kids from my school, Emerson College, which was a theater school, were auditioning, and a number of them got in. And it turned out, in fact, that my roommate ended up best friends with a woman who actually was dating the company manager. So I ended up getting invited to attend basically a preview before it actually officially opened. And that was actually where I first saw Paul. I didn't meet him.
You saw him like across the crowded floor and your eyes locked, and it was
Well, he was actually on stage singing a
Oh,
Whisper
okay.
song in
And he
Hair.
was blinded by the light, so he couldn't
And
see you.
I took one look at, and I instantly knew. I said, this guy knows who he is. It was
All
so
right, that's what I was
obvious.
talking about. The right place at the right
Yeah,
time cards. You
exactly,
both had it,
exactly.
He maybe he wasn't aware, but you certainly were.
Well, we ended up locking eyes at the backstage where I was waiting for my friends when he came by. We did not speak at that moment, but I definitely, I didn't know for sure, but I think I caught his attention.
Okay. All right. So going with that, um, so you both have been raised in relative, well, it sounds like it, I mean, to me, from my point of view, in relatively well-to-do families. You're in New England, um, right? I
Well,
mean,
I was at that time, I was originally from New Jersey, but I relocated to the Boston
But
area.
your father was from
Well,
Massachusetts.
that's true. Right.
your father was what? No?
My father was from Worcester, Mass.
Oh,
So
okay.
Jersey.
So, all right. So, um, let's see. So were the communities pretty, proper, people didn't do wild things. There weren't wild parties going on all
Well,
around.
it was the hair.
There were people, it was like there wasn't any wild teen houses around where they were circulating God knows what or anything like that. You were both pretty well.
You see, Liz was at was with the theater crowd at Emerson College. I was with as I was referred to as a jock at Boston University. I was on the track team.
Oh, okay.
My hair was quite short, but I had been a professional singer since I was 10 years old. So
Oh,
I had
all
been
right.
I
Okay.
become a
All right.
professional with the Boston Opera Company when I was 13 years old, and so I with Sarah Caldwell of all people, and she was the running, she was the artistic director of the Boston Opera Company. So at that point, I had sung in a number of rock and roll groups and whatnot. So at any rate, so when I got to be a freshman at Boston University in 1969, after I graduated from high school,
And, and also after your father had died.
my
And
my
Martin
father
Luther
my
King
father
and
passed away
RFK.
in also in April of 1968. So 1968 was a very pivotal year for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Realized I
Between the
realized
two
that year between,
assassinations.
and Robert Kennedy, of course, was killed in June.
Yeah.
So for me to realize at that point, it was just I just said, that life is short. And when I saw in the Boston Globe that they were opening auditions for this New York company of hair, I said, I have 3 weeks to spend for Christmas vacation, and this is my opportunity to just try out for the heck of it. Well, I tried out and they gave me the lead. And so that was a cosmic coincidence. Okay.
Yeah. So let's talk about hair because a lot of people don't really know the significance of that musical, how groundbreaking it was, and I think it was one of the first like rock operas, and it was a very controversial, shocking musical. It was about counterculture through portrayals of sex, drugs, nudity, obscene language, exploring things like gas, bisexuality, and interracial relationships and non-monogamy. So, I mean, those were pretty racy times that were happening, and there you are, prime, ready to go all kinds of different directions because you're just like immersed in this. And so you're in New York City,
No, no, Boston.
Yeah,
This was
this
the
was the
Boston.
Boston.
Opera.
Okay, all
So we,
right. So that's my next question here, because I'm trying to like piece it together from what little I know really and what I remember. Because in 1966 I was 10, and I was living in Marion, Iowa, which is like out of something like the Music Man, and then we moved to Boulder, Colorado, which was like a different planet in another galaxy. And so I don't really remember all this stuff going on like you would have observed in being in, I mean, those are like to me hot spots, of society and culture and community. And um, so, and it was mostly happening to me from my memory again, Washington and the South, where all the civil rights movements were happening. And I think it's hard for younger people today to really realize what life was like back then and how this was all, changing what was considered normal. And television had come into our lives. Vietnam was coming into our living rooms, and it was helping the world, or some faster than others, to be aware of this political mood, and it was entertainment. And so you're thinking, I mean, that you've told the story so many times, and you kind of got your script almost, because you've told us so many times in books and whatever. But what do you think that other young people were thinking at that time? I mean, you were kind of immersed in the happening places, but what do you think that other young people across the country was thinking about this whole movement?
Well,
Um,
I have a definite, memory of, as I mentioned before, I got involved with hair. I was very involved with the anti-war movement that was generated out of the local universities, and our college was one of them. And we used to do street, of course, coming from a theater school, we used to do street theater. I was actually in communications. That's one of the reasons why my friends were the ones who auditioned for the show. I wasn't a part of that. But the idea that the anti war movement really was the basis on which I entered into the hair experience. And I could see that this was literally carrying, somehow the message of our generation. And that's what I was really connecting to when we ended up, the show went on for a year. So when Paul got into the show, I was constantly involved because I had my own level of friends and engagement. But as we began to know each other and then started dating, obviously it became much. I became a part of it far more seriously at that point. But the idea that this was really an extension of our generation, and it was carrying the meaning of the anti-war movement that we took very seriously. And so in fact, that was one of the things I think you very very beautifully described, the reality of the show. One of the things that was so obvious, for instance, was the fact that every single show that went to a major city like Boston was always locally cast, and a lot of kids who had no credentials got in. And to talk about equal opportunity, there were plenty of black kids and orientals, and every single race was represented, and it was very organic. It wasn't plotted so much that way. They were all just talented, and there was enough of them coming out, certainly in Boston, to fill that beautifully. In fact, we have one wonderful story about a young man who was a taxi cab driver, and he ended up picking up people who were the casting people for the hair uh, auditions. And by the end of the ride, they offered him an audition, and he went in, became Paul's understudy.
oh my
That,
goodness.
that's how serious they were about finding genuine talent, regardless of connectivity of any kind. So it was
And
really
you could do that there at that time where you were, because there would have been so many people from all different walks of life. The strong, like, neighborhoods of the Irish Catholic, and as compared to the Jewish neighborhoods, to the Italians or whatever. Now, in Marion, Iowa, we did not have that. And I know in Boulder, Colorado, we did not have that. They wouldn't have been able to get a very realistic picture of society and culture at that time, where I was at that time. And but you had this just like wealth of people to pick from. And so you were already, Liz, already into it. You were working, you were walking the walk, you were talking the talk. And Paul's attitude was like, well, life's too short, and I think I'll just do this. And so then like he either to be with you, he either had to like get with your program or or find the reason he liked it too, right?
Right, exactly, exactly. Well, I think in Paul's case, the audition obviously was something that, we couldn't figure out how we would have met otherwise. Although there was one thing, I had actually lived in an apartment that was within walking distance of Boston University. So I don't know, maybe some other way would have been found if that hadn't
Well,
happened.
we
But
just, the strange thing is that we did keep bumping into each other. I remember pulling my car up to a parking space one day, right next to the Boston Common. You could park your car for 4 hours at a time there. So I
For
pulled my,
free.
yeah, exactly. So I pulled my car up and it had snowed that morning, okay? And it was like early March or something. And Liz is coming down on her bicycle. And I remembered her from hanging out at the theater and whatnot. And we didn't really
Being
know
a
each
groupie, kind
other.
of.
So I thought to
I
myself,
didn't mind.
I, I thought to myself, now that's an unusual coincidence. Now
Yeah,
here I am, just doing this
yeah.
and I thought, gee, what's she doing here? What's she doing in my life here?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So at
Which
any,
was adorable, of course, right? So you had to notice for that.
right. So at any rate, and
Right.
I think I said to her, I don't think it's a good day for you to be riding your bicycle.
I
And she said, well, who are you to tell me
Who
what?
are you to tell me that? Yeah, exactly. So at any rate,
Yeah.
yeah, I had a lot to learn, and she had a lot to learn about me.
And what was your dress style at that time?
I mean, typical of the time. I do remember wearing,
Did you have a cute little beret and just like really, like college student like, or were you more like, I'm gonna throw away my pearls and my sensible flats and dress how I want to?
well, I think the hippie dress, I think, was about where we were at the time. I mean, that was something that I certainly felt comfortable with.
Oh
Uh,
my goodness! So I
Tie-dye
still wear
and,
it. I still have it.
and tie-dyed and casual.
Elizabeth
Yes,
was a
love beads, and long hair with a
very classy woman. That's all I can say, as I
And
recall.
Paul, what kind of a car were you driving? Some cute little sports car or a clunker?
I was driving a Triumph TR4A.
Okay, I can picture you in that.
The wire wheels and the spinners and the whole
Yeah.
deal.
I
Mhm.
learned,
And
and
she had her bicycle with a cute little basket on the front, looking very,
yeah,
you
Yeah, you had the basket. Yeah,
and I learned how
and
to
it was
I learned
green.
how to drive standard on that car.
know.
Those
And he
cars,
was okay with that. He
It
was
wasn't
okay with
easy.
that.
they
It
were
wasn't
not
easy.
they were not meant for people with weak legs. Let's put it that way. Clutch. She complained to me at one point. She said, "The clutch on that car, I can barely get it down."
It
I
required
said,
And you
It's a tractor engine they put in those things."
and it was a car really only he could drive because he knew all the nuances of exactly how you had to, it's just like my dad's Jeep that nobody else could drive but
Yep.
him, and he didn't know why anybody else had a hard time. And I have such horrible thoughts of driving that Jeep on a hill trying to start at night. And anyway, I
Yeah.
digress.
Well,
This is great. So okay, so you pull him in and he comes in because he definitely wants to be with you and he's going to catch up and you have this great, I mean, sounds very romantic and all this is
it
like
was. It was
the
a,
summer,
fun stuff going on. And so at some point, so okay, so he's just getting into college, right? And
year that would
all
have
right,
been.
and what was your
Yeah.
first intended major, Paul?
I was going to be a journalist. I was
Okay.
I was
And
waiting to get into journalism school. I was an English major when I got into the show. So that
okay, and Liz, same with
I
you,
was actually communications major. I
communications.
ended up going into, advertising and marketing after I graduated from school.
Okay, so then you became romantically involved while you were in college then?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm actually a couple of years older than Paul, so
Hmm.
I guess I might have been
The
a
cougar.
senior that year. I'm sophomore, but he waited to finish school because he did hair for the year. So
Okay.
he
All
became
right. So
Buster.
you
So I had to go back
Yeah.
and take.
So he was becoming well trained at that point, and you were too were seeing a path forward for what you could do, and I imagine you would have done a lot of time talking about it and being aware as journalists and thinking about the human story. What were your viewpoints about what you thought the rest of the country was waking up to?
You know, I really believed that our generation was doing it, that we were actually ending the Vietnam War, that it was real, and that that and to show my naivete about the reality of ending war, I thought that ending the draft was one of the strong signs of ending war. I had no idea what that really meant. So that I think was part of what our generation got hit with was we lived through something that was authentic and real and powerful. And one of the things I find today, and I mean in the last decades, is hearing these stories about the boomer generation were all basically drugged out hippies that were peace, love, tra and I went, that's not true, and that's part of the way in which the peace movement itself was denigrated. Okay, that was
Exactly. Because like movies like plays like Hair was reflecting something that yes it was happening, but it doesn't mean that it was happening everywhere with every young person with the same intensity and the same angst and the same proclivity to get into off the path you're supposed to be on to. um, and so there would have been pockets of the country like Marion, Iowa was not there.
yeah.
Boulder, Colorado was getting there. My view of the West Coast has always been that they were already there, and they had a
Well,
a different take on it.
that does tie into the Laurel Canyon music scene, which actually has been investigated for a long, quite thoroughly about the amount of involvement that the interests, let's say, some of it being coming from the CIA, an interest in basically controlling the movement was quite active, and that involved both San Francisco and Laurel Canyon music scenes, and the use of hallucinogenics that were really coming in through the distribution was really coming from the CIA. So there was a real intention to sort of turn our peace movement into this drug scene that then could be presented as if this was the reality and that's what stuck, you see.
Right,
Back
the
when
narrative that we'll come back to.
you look
So along those lines, you have the war, whatever's going on with the FBI and the CIA and all those things after the McCarthy era and after the 50s, the la la time, and the baby boom generation. You have Martin Luther King. And in my research, I mean, I didn't know this because, again, I was young, growing up at Marion, and I haven't nowhere know as much as you do, and I never will. But in my research, I found that MLK was a very controversial figure in the 60s and early 70s. His unfavorable ratings were high, especially among white Americans who often felt he was harming the civil rights movement. And while Black Americans largely supported him, depending on where they were, of course, negative views persisted even after his assassination. Some felt that he had brought these bad opinions and his assassination upon himself, especially when he talked about the race problems in the North and said, it's not just in the South, it's in the North, it's everywhere. People who are different from you are, they're possibly something else, and we don't, I mean, I think it was better in the North just because of Civil War emotions, but what do you think about that? Were you aware that there were like so many negative feelings about him at the same time they were like, but he's a great person and he's,
well,
I mean, describe
I,
that.
I think that what I remember clearly was the fact that JFK was taking it on frontally. The whole civil rights movement was clearly very important to him, and MLK was very important to him.
Were they close acquaintances?
I don't know that personally, but we know that there were people who were part of the Democratic Party. The Dunphy family in the Boston area, for instance, were very close to MLK and his family. And so this is something that clearly was a part of certain Democratic people, and certainly in the Boston area, that was the fact. But I think that what I would say is that in terms of what I do remember, and again, it's been something I think that's come to light and become very important, is that it seems that when he crossed over from focusing on civil rights into the Vietnam War is really when he got into trouble. MLK got into trouble. Okay. And I think it's the same trouble that JFK got into when he became the warrior for peace that we all love so much. And I think MLK became a warrior for peace too, but I don't know if he realized that's what he had signed on for. We certainly know from our own digging into the Fitzgerald history how much JFK was really honoring the legacy of the Fitzgerald family by taking this on at this point.
Right. Okay. Also, somewhere in my research I came across is that his own son commented that his father MLK became more liked after he died, and one of the reasons perhaps was not only because it was the 70s, and which was a little bit different from the raw 60s, beginning of all of this, or more visible beginning of it, I should say. One possible reason that those older Americans who didn't like him so much had died, and there was just more more awareness among people who were in the know and by today's standards woke, and so they would have been more being able to bring the movement of honoring his life and what he was about. I mean, he was a very flawed man. Many people in those sorts of high positions have a long way to fall, and they get revered and aren't as able to be human, or have to watch what mistakes they make. And of course, one hears all the stories about politicians and whatever, but Martin Luther King sort of was in a political role without really being a politician, just because of, he's talking about what's happening in society. He's not just preaching in his church. He's out there.
He was effective at it. That's why he had to be stopped as far as they were concerned. It's the same with JFK and with RFK.
Right.
Yeah. There was just that I don't know if we would call them being part of the MAGA crowd, if we use current nomenclature for how those people were, what they like or didn't like. It's hard to figure. I'm still trying to figure out all of that. But basically what we know is that people in your circles thought well of MLK and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy. And and there were certainly pockets, I would say, of everywhere where one would say he's going to be well liked here. He's not going to be so admired here. But what would you say was the strongest part of the country that revered him and appreciated him and listened to him and thought well of him?
Well,
I think Boston was a center of that. Boston had always been very active in terms of the anti-slavery movement. It went back to the 19th century. They were very active here. And that was not the Irish Catholic population necessarily. That was the conservative Republican population, which was very, by today's standards, extremely liberal.
Right. How did that change?
Oh, that's just the thing about being in Massachusetts. It's a very, New England has its own culture. And
Yes.
it was the original Northern culture that came from Britain. We have a friend who's married to an English guy, and she said, New England is just like Old England. We go back to visit Neville's family, and it's the same, except it's smaller than it is here. But the towns are laid out the same, and the thinking in many cases is the same.
Well, there's something else I think that's important for people to understand about the Boston area, that when it came to, for instance, people going to Harvard who were not allowed in, basically Black people got into Harvard before Irish people did, because the hatred of the Irish by the British and the ones represented by the British were the Brahmins. The Brahmins hated the Fitzgeralds because the Fitzgeralds represented basically the crisis they could not stand. That was one of the reasons why there was a genocide against the Fitzgeralds, ultimately over a 400-year span from the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 until.
And we're going to come to that in a bit. So that's how we'll end, because I wanted you to be able to talk about what's coming up next for you. Okay, so let's talk about today, by today's standards, and what you've seen in your wisdom and, well, your wisdom. So the mood in the country now is quite different than it was in the 60s. Of course, it is difficult to compare. But as older observers of life with your journalist lenses, and as human beings and global citizens, how would you describe the narrative of these times? How do you think historians will describe these times? And how do you think MLK would fare if he were born, living in these times? How would he be similar or different?
Well, I think that he was an example of genuine leadership. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes that has been made since the 1960s is to identify people on the basis of their race or their color. I think that the census has been changed. Now, how do you describe yourself? Well, do you consider yourself white? Do you consider yourself whatever? The fact is that I think that was self-evident. I mean, we worked with people, we had a lot of friends. There was a friend of ours who was a New York City filmmaker. St. Clair Bourne was the man's name. Incredible talent. And he went and took a number of Black radicals from the 1960s, the Stokely Carmichael type guys, and he put them together in a group and he brought them to Northern Ireland to experience what it was like being white and being the victim of prejudice. And real severe prejudice under the British occupation. And he would put these people, he put a camera up in the room, and this is back in the days of 16 millimeter film, no video. He put the 16 millimeter film camera in one room in the hotel, and every day when these people would come back, these are Black activists who'd spent their lives in Selma, Alabama, and various places. When they saw the way white people were being treated by other white people, they were literally shocked. There was one I recall one guy saying, he said, I've never seen this. He says, I'm having a nervous breakdown. I don't understand. What's going on here? I thought it was all about being Black. And it's about class, and it's about other things.
That's where I come in, because I came out of an environment where I really understood that the real common ground is working class, as opposed to, because when you approach everybody with a common understanding of what you need, what the problems are for the average family, okay, that are all similar, you find an ability to communicate between all kinds of different cultures that doesn't have a problem.
All skin colors, all religious persuasions, sexual, gender identity, all of that.
And that was basically broken down. The biggest fear that the elitists in this country had was a true working class revolution. Okay, they might have been spooked by this Bolshevik revolution, but they had the problem in the 19th century, long before Bolshevism took over, for the working class idea. Okay, and they were always against the working class. So this was part of what the attempt was to sever people at some organic level that's natural for them and divvy them up in a way that then they start infighting. So it becomes an issue of a black person being denied this, or a Chinese person being denied that, or a Mexican, and it all became infighting.
But that consciousness was actually very much a part of the industrial area in New England.
Yeah.
I mean, my ancestors came from Ireland and from England, and they worked in the textile mills in there, and then they saw the sign on the wall, "Come to Dover, New Hampshire to work in the mills." Okay, and they did. The whole family would come. But this is what happened, and they would work alongside the Polish workers who'd come in, and the Russian workers who'd come in, and the Jews
and the Greeks,
and so and the Italians, and so they would. There was never any. It was always an idea of cooperation with these people.
Across cultures, because they thought they had to. Before, that was like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and there were a few in the bourgeoisie and there were a lot in the proletariat group, and and even if black people were up there, which they could have been because of being slaves and sort of that sort of thing, it was just a completely different environment. America was a land of opportunity, and the land where they could escape their class distinctions from where they came from. So how do you think that historians will describe these times? Whereas if you're a woman, if you're Mexican, if you're disabled, if you're trans, I mean, all of that's gone. It doesn't matter whether you're Polish or Jewish or whatever. How are they going to describe this?
Well, I found it interesting that when we first encountered the war in Gaza, first got people's attention, one of the surprises, it seemed, for some level of people was the fact that there was a huge outpouring of support for the Palestinians from the trans people. And that seemed to get the attention of people who seemed to act as if they felt they didn't expect that from trans people. And I wondered why.
I've noticed
that. I don't know, this was, it was just something that it was a minor report, it wasn't a big deal, but it got my attention because
it got mine too. That's interesting.
You did notice that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it said, why would they be surprised? I'm wondering. That made me question the observers who seemed shocked by it. Where are you getting your idea?
Yeah. Why is this? How's this starting? Yeah.
Exactly. And I felt that was a little indication of the way they pigeonhole people and make assumptions about how they kind of have some assumption that's going to hold about how they will act under certain circumstances, which they found wasn't the case.
What will make it to the media? What will become the narrative and all that? And how we'll all either follow the crowd or we'll break off into different factions, we'll become like the Walking Dead, without being dead, we'll be, forming all these different communities, there'll be how we'll either come together or stay apart and be crazy. Well, I'm looking at the time, and I know that we talked about 45 minutes, and so we're very close to that. So it seems like a good place to stop here because I want to give you time to talk about what's next. So we could go on for hours and hours and hours, and I would love it. But we do have to end this part of our MLK event here. So thank you, Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. Now, would you like to tell our audience about what's coming up for you next on your busy agendas, about what you're working on?
Ready or should I?
You
All right.
start. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, we've
Maybe
actually,
5 minutes or less.
in our evolution, which I will very quickly summarize just to get to this moment in time. When we first started out in 1970 in hair, and that eventually led us to getting married, and eventually led Paul back to the idea of journalism and started doing a talk show. We ended up in a very pivotal position in 1975, okay, to really witness the rise of Jimmy Carter as president. And the peace movement seemed to really come alive. The end of the Vietnam War, it seemed as if we were ready for peace, and we witnessed the whole thing. And what happened in 1976, Jimmy Carter gets in, and suddenly, during this evolution, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in December 27, 1979, and all of a sudden the whole effort towards peace that we were witnessing slowly emerging vanished. The entire core of people we had been interviewing for a documentary on the SALT Treaty that was negotiated under 3 presidents to try to get to détente with the Soviet Union evaporated. And we just witnessed this and said, what just happened? How did it just disappear? But
And
what,
you were there, so you should be able to see it.
right, what we witnessed was there didn't seem to be a correct response from the Carter administration to
Yeah.
the event. They reacted as if it was a total surprise.
They overreact.
They overreacted in a way that made us question what was really going on. Specifically, Carter described it as the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. When 75,000 troops crossed into Afghanistan, it was a big deal, but it was not the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. Afghanistan at that point had actually been it was in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. The U.S. had actually made that happen after World War II with the creation of Pakistan out of part of Afghanistan, and Pakistan becoming the ally of the U.S., and they literally deserted Afghanistan. So the whole thing just didn't quite add, and there was no importance at that moment to Afghanistan. Nobody even knew where it was, except for hippies. That was what the best.
Somewhere over there.
So we ended up getting the first visa into Kabul after the Soviet invasion, when the Western media were kicked out about a year and a half later. And we witnessed basically the creation of the mainstream narrative at the highest levels inside the U.S. government, listen to me, government, no, inside PBS, CBS, and ABC. We worked with all 3 networks on different projects, and we witnessed how the narrative was created from what we knew on the ground that we had witnessed to what they put into the story that became Americans' perception of what happened. So a lot of what we're living with today, you see, and this is why it's so important when you ask, what do I think today, is this legacy of the corruption of the narrative at such a profound level that there is so little reality left in it that people are beginning to see these gaps in, when you try to observe reality and you're saying, this doesn't add up. Well, we had that experience back in 1979, and I think that's what a lot of people are beginning to come to. So in that sense, I think we are progressing. Even as difficult a time as we are in, we are progressing.
But when our book came out in 2009, Invisible History, the audiences would say to us, why didn't I know anything about this? What took you so long to write this book?
It wasn't us.
It wasn't us. We weren't the ones. We were telling the same story for years and years.
Yeah. But the walk away from the narrative process is really the big shift that we made to get to this
And
moment.
being able to get that narrative so that people can hear it, because this is a big place. There are lots of narratives out there, and I know you've talked about narratives as the narrative is whatever your narrative is. What your viewpoint.
That's it. The key
Yeah,
is
but
reality.
our narrative should be based on what really is instead of what we're being told or what. Yeah, there's going to be nuances, like growing up in living in Marion, Iowa is going to be very different from Fremont, Nebraska, where my grandma was, or Boulder, Colorado, or Santa Rosa, California, or Boston, or New York City, or Akron, Ohio, where I am. But anyway, how can people get a hold of you, or where to find out where they can? I had a perfect line here. Would you like to tell our audience how you can both be reached so inquiring minds can satisfy their newly found need to know more?
Very well put.
Okay,
Very well
well,
put.
we actually have our memoirs. We have a series. We're working on book 3 now, and it's at valediction.net. The title of the memoir is Valediction, Three Nights of Desmond, Valediction, Resurrection, and we're working on Valediction, Revelation, which will complete the journey. And we do have our books on Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. So what you've got is the journalistic work we did, and then the transition into the narrative, which we really discovered. And the key is we really had to focus on our own narrative, meaning why did we want to do what we did? And what did we really accomplish in doing it?
Those right place, the right time cards that you both held, and you were like, where do I have this? He had his, and just like, they match, they go together, and bing, and then you know that you're in the right place at the right time with somebody else.
Right. It was ordained to happen.
It's ordained to happen. I mean, why not? All right, so I'm looking at the time again. Like, you've got places to go, things to do. So thank you so much for being here. This has been fascinating, and I really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope you had a good time too. So thank you to Birgit Ben Ely, our amazing events director, for an amazing MLK event for 2025, and for being my tech assistant throughout. And to Angel Short, our executive director, who has too much to do and who somehow knows how to do everything. Thank you to all the people who each volunteered to fill the job descriptions of at least 5 separate job roles from around the world, and who bring global awareness in a real sense to our WE team. Thank you to Rick Opek, our founder, for forming We the World so many years ago. Thank you to our audience for listening and supporting us. We hope you have enjoyed this event. Please join us at we.net, and if you can, please invest in our efforts toward making a world that works for all at we.net/donate. Let's go from a me society to a we society. Goodbye from all of us at We the World.
Thank you.